She fought for her country on distant battlefields. But when she came home, the real battle began. A fight against silence, prejudice, and forgotten honor. This is Grace's story. The rattling wheels of the old bus echoed along the cracked pavement as Grace Daniels peered through the smudged window, watching the familiar sights of her hometown approach. 4 years. 4 long years away, serving in a war overseas. Years filled with danger, sacrifice, and a relentless desire to protect a country that often seemed indifferent to the sacrifices of its soldiers. Now, she was finally home. Willow Creek stretched out before her like a faded photograph, its quiet streets lined with weathered brick buildings, the clock tower standing sentinel over the town square, and the golden hues of the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that reached toward the sidewalks. To anyone else, it was a peaceful place. To Grace, it was a complicated mix of nostalgia and apprehension. She adjusted the strap of her worn military duffel bag and swallowed hard, bracing herself for the moment when the bus would come to a stop. Her heart swelled with hope. Hope for a fresh start, for the warmth of familiar faces, for a place to finally rest her weary spirit. But beneath that hope, a knot of unease tightened in her chest. As the bus rolled slowly into the station, she noticed something she hadn't expected. The streets were unusually quiet. Few people lingered on the sidewalks, and those who glanced her way quickly looked down or away. The smiles she had imagined were absent, replaced by guarded, sometimes suspicious expressions. Her footsteps echoed through Main Street as she made her way toward her mother's house. The town hadn't changed much. Same old bakery on the corner, the small grocery store with its peeling paint, the familiar church steeple rising against the sky. But the atmosphere was different, heavier somehow. A subtle chill seemed to follow her, as if she was walking through a place that hadn't quite welcomed her back. Whispers trailed behind her, voices dropping silent when she turned. Groups of people who once greeted her warmly now exchanged wary looks. She caught fragments of hushed conversations. She's back, but things aren't the same. Wonder how long she'll last. Not like before, Grace tried to shake off the discomfort. She reminded herself that she was here to rebuild, to reclaim her place, to show that her years of service had not been in vain. But the invisible barriers were real and unyielding. At her mother's doorstep, she found a small refuge. Her mother's arms enveloped her in a hug that felt like balm to her bruised soul. "Welcome home, Grace," she whispered. Yet even here, in the safety of family, there was an unspoken warning. "People around here, they don't always know how to welcome someone like you. Be careful." Grace nodded, knowing all too well what her mother meant. The town held deep roots and old wounds, and her return stirred memories some wished to forget. In the days that followed, Grace confronted the realities of her new old life. She sent out countless job applications, hoping for a chance to work, to contribute, to be seen not as an outsider, but as a valued member of the community. But responses were sparse, interviews scarce, and polite refusals became routine. Doors seemed to close softly but decisively in her face. Community events offered little relief. At town meetings, she noticed eyes darting away when she spoke. At the local diner, hushed conversations ceased when she entered. The warmth she'd longed for was replaced by a palpable coolness. One evening, she attended a veterans gathering at the American Legion Hall. She hoped for camaraderie, for shared stories, and mutual respect. Instead, she was met with silence and sidelong glances. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as she approached. The unspoken message was clear. She was tolerated at best, and for some, an uncomfortable reminder of changes they preferred to ignore. Despite the cold reception, Grace clung to her resolve. Each morning she woke determined to keep moving forward, drawing strength from memories of service and sacrifice. She found small pockets of peace in morning runs along the creek, in helping her mother tend the garden, in letters she wrote but never sent. Letters filled with dreams, frustrations, and hopes for justice. Yet prejudice followed her like a shadow. In the grocery store, a man muttered slurs just loud enough for her to hear. Teens on the street mocked her stride, whispering cruel words that cut deeper than any wound. These encounters were few, but they left lasting scars. Grace's story echoed a truth known too well to many. The honor of service too often met with the sting of discrimination. But she refused to be silenced. She vowed to become more than a forgotten soldier. She would be a beacon for the young black girls of Willow Creek, proof that courage and dignity can withstand even the coldest of welcomes. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Grace stood on her porch and watched the town she loved and feared. The journey ahead was uncertain and steeped in struggle, but in her heart burned a fierce flame, one of hope, resilience, and an unyielding fight for recognition, respect, and belonging. Her homecoming was not the end of her battle. It was only the beginning. The morning sun spilled over Willow Creek, casting a gentle light on the quiet streets as Grace Daniels stepped out of her mother's small house. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and blooming magnolias, but the beauty of the day did little to ease the tension coiling in her chest. Today marked her first full week back, and the weight of the town's silent judgment pressed harder than ever. Grace tightened her jacket and walked toward the town center, where the local employment office was tucked between the post office and a closed-down cafe. It was here she hoped to find a job, any job, to prove her worth, to remind Willow Creek that she was more than just a black woman, more than a soldier who had served her country in far-off lands. She was a daughter, a sister, a fighter, and she refused to fade into the shadows. Inside the small office, a faded sign read, "Helping Hands Employment Services," but the warmth one might expect was absent. The receptionist, a middle-aged white woman with pursed lips and cold eyes, barely looked up when Grace approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I'm here to inquire about job opportunities," Grace said steadily, meeting the woman's gaze. The receptionist sighed, tapping at her keyboard without urgency. "We have nothing at the moment. You can check back later." Grace nodded, suppressing the frustration bubbling inside her. She knew better than to argue here. The subtle dismissal was a familiar pattern. Yet, she refused to leave without making her presence known. "Could I leave my resume?" she asked. The woman gave a non-committal grunt and slid a dusty clipboard across the desk. Grace filled out the form carefully, writing with deliberate precision. The receptionist glanced at the paper and muttered something about overqualified, before sliding it into a pile that looked like it had been untouched for weeks. Grace left the office, the thin hope she'd clung to fading, but not extinguished. Her next stop was the town library, a place she'd often visited as a child. She hoped to volunteer, to reconnect with the community in any way possible. Inside, the librarian, a stern woman named Mrs. Caldwell, looked up as Grace entered. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Caldwell's voice was polite but distant. "I'd like to volunteer," Grace said, "to help with reading programs or organizing books." Mrs. Caldwell adjusted her glasses and studied Grace carefully. "We don't usually take volunteers without prior experience." Grace took a deep breath. "I'm willing to learn." The librarian's expression softened for a moment before returning to neutrality. "We'll see," she said. "Fill out this form and I'll get back to you." As Grace left, she felt the familiar sting of being measured and found wanting, not because of her skills, but because of the color of her skin. The days passed with more of the same. Polite smiles, masking cold shoulders. Job applications met with silence. Invitations to community events that never came. Yet Grace found small victories in unexpected places. A kind word from an elderly man who remembered her father's kindness. A nod from a young teacher who admired her service. a friendly smile from a shopkeeper who'd once welcomed her as a child. But the hostility simmered beneath the surface. On the bus, a group of teenagers whispered and pointed. In the grocery store, a clerk took an unusually long time to ring up her purchases. At the church where she'd hoped to reconnect, the pastor's sermon on unity felt hollow as she caught skeptical glances from the congregation. One evening, Grace attended a local veterans meeting. The room was filled with men and women who had served, but their eyes held wariness rather than welcome. When Grace introduced herself, she was met with silence, then murmurs. Some nodded politely, others avoided eye contact. After the meeting, a grizzled veteran named Harold approached her. "It's not easy being the first," he said quietly. "They don't know how to handle someone like you." Grace nodded, grateful for the rare gesture of solidarity. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said. "I just want to be part of the community again." Harold's eyes held a flicker of respect. "Then show them who you are. Don't let them erase you." Those words echoed in Grace's mind as she walked home, beneath a sky streaked with stars. The fight wasn't just about finding a job or making friends. It was about reclaiming her identity in a place that tried to forget her. In the days that followed, Grace began to speak up more boldly. She attended town meetings, asking questions about veteran services, racial equity, and community resources. She connected with other Black residents, sharing stories and building quiet alliances. But not everyone welcomed her voice. At one meeting, a councilman dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "We don't have a race problem here," he said, his tone sharp. "You're stirring things up unnecessarily." Grace's response was calm but firm. "Silence isn't peace. Ignoring the problem only makes it worse." The room fell into uneasy murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, others scowled. The divide was clear. Back home, Grace's mother reminded her gently, "This town's wounds run deep." Change takes time. Grace knew the path ahead would be difficult, but with every challenge, her resolve hardened. She was no longer just a visitor or a stranger. She was a veteran, a survivor, and a woman determined to be seen and heard. The fight for recognition and respect had only just begun. The weeks following Grace's return to Willow Creek were marked by a quiet storm brewing beneath the town's polished surface. As she pushed herself to engage more actively, the subtle undercurrents of resentment she had first sensed began to swell into more overt opposition. At the local diner, where veterans sometimes gathered, Grace found herself a stranger once again. Conversations dwindled to hushed whispers when she approached. One afternoon, a man she vaguely recognized, a fellow veteran named Bill, glanced at her over his coffee, his smile tight and uneasy. "You sure you want to stir the pot, Grace?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not stirring anything. I'm just asking for what's right." Bill looked away, shaking his head. "Some folks here don't want to hear it. They'd rather keep things quiet." Grace felt a pang of loneliness, but refused to back down. Her sense of duty didn't end with her service overseas. It extended here, to the town that tried to forget her. The local newspaper, the Willow Creek Gazette, had thus far ignored her story. But rumors of her outspoken stance began to ripple through the town, stirring both admiration and backlash. One morning, Grace discovered a letter slipped under her door. The paper was thick and official-looking, but the tone was anything but welcoming. It was a formal warning from the town council, cautioning her against disruptive behavior and urging respect for community traditions. Grace read the letter twice, then folded it deliberately. It was clear. Her presence was a threat to the old order. Determined not to be intimidated, she reached out to Sarah Thompson, a young local journalist with a reputation for fairness and courage. Sarah had grown up in Willow Creek, but left to pursue journalism in the city before recently returning. Their first meeting was cautious but hopeful. Sarah listened intently as Grace recounted the cold shoulders, the veiled insults, and the overt dismissal she had endured. She spoke of her service, her love for Willow Creek, and her refusal to be erased. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. Your story needs to be told, not just for you, but for everyone who's been silenced here. Together, they planned to bring Grace's experience to light. Sarah promised to write a feature that would expose the town's hidden prejudices and spark a conversation long overdue. But the backlash was swift. Within days of the article's publication, Grace began receiving anonymous threats, letters filled with hate, harsh words scrawled on her mailbox, and unsettling phone calls late at night. Her mother, once a pillar of strength, worried for her safety, urging caution. "Grace," she said one evening, holding her daughter's hands tightly, "this fight could break you." Grace shook her head, fierce and unwavering. "If I break, then they win. I'm not stopping. Not for me. Not for any of us." The town's split became more apparent. At the grocery store, some customers averted their eyes. Others whispered behind her back. Yet a small but growing group of allies began to emerge. Young people, a few longtime residents, and even some veterans who admired her courage. At the community center, Grace organized a gathering titled Voices of Willow Creek, inviting residents to share their stories of exclusion, hope, and resilience. The turnout surprised everyone. Hundreds filled the modest hall, a tapestry of faces united by a desire for change. The event was both uplifting and raw. People spoke of their pain, their dreams, and their fears. Some confessions shocked the room. Others brought tears. Grace spoke last, her voice steady and filled with passion. "We can't rewrite the past," she said, "but we can shape the future, together." Not everyone was ready to listen. Outside, protesters gathered, waving signs demanding silence and respect for tradition. The local police kept a wary distance, tension crackling in the air. Despite the turmoil, Grace's message resonated. The local church, once a bastion of exclusion, invited her to speak about her experience and the meaning of true community. Her words challenged many to reflect on their own prejudices. Meanwhile, Sarah's ongoing coverage brought regional attention to Willow Creek. Reports aired on local radio and TV, prompting conversations far beyond the town's borders. Advocacy groups reached out, offering support and resources. Back at home, Grace's nights were restless, shadowed by anxiety and fear. But each morning, she rose with renewed determination. The fight for recognition was no longer just personal. It was a beacon for others who had been marginalized. One evening, as she prepared for another community meeting, Grace received a call from Harold, the veteran who had once offered quiet support. "Grace, there's talk of organizing a veterans coalition," he said. "We want you to lead it." Her heart swelled. The journey was far from over, but this was progress, a sign that walls were beginning to crumble. As the sun set over Willow Creek, Grace looked out at the fading light, her resolve shining brighter than ever. The town might resist, but she would keep pushing, her voice unwavering. Because some battles are bigger than fear, and some voices refuse to be silenced. The formation of the Veterans Coalition marked a turning point for Grace. It was a tangible sign that her fight was no longer solitary. A diverse group of men and women, many veterans like herself, gathered in the community hall, united by a shared desire to confront the inequalities that had long been swept under the rug. Grace stood at the front, the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, but also the fierce pride of being heard. The coalition's mission was clear: to advocate for veterans' rights, ensure fair treatment, and challenge the systemic racism woven into Willow Creek's institutions. The first few meetings were a mixture of hope and tension. Some veterans were hesitant, afraid of backlash, while others came with stories of pain and exclusion that echoed Grace's own. Together, they crafted a plan to hold town officials accountable, demand transparency, and push for policy changes. However, as the coalition gained visibility, so did the opposition. The town's more conservative factions, including influential business leaders and politicians, viewed the movement as a threat to the status quo. Grace found herself the target of vicious rumors and smear campaigns designed to undermine her credibility. One afternoon, as she prepared to address the town council alongside her coalition, she received an anonymous letter accusing her of fabricating stories to gain sympathy and disrupt the peace. The letter was laced with racial slurs and threats. Instead of deterring her, the hateful note fueled her determination. She shared it with her coalition, who rallied around her with fierce loyalty. At the council meeting, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters packed the room, their faces a mosaic of hope and defiance. Opponents sat stiffly, their expressions guarded. Grace took the podium with steady resolve. Her voice carried across the room, recounting the injustices veterans faced, not just in recognition or benefits, but in daily life, from employment discrimination to social exclusion. She outlined the coalition's demands: comprehensive reviews of veteran services, bias training for all town employees, and a public apology from officials who had ignored the community's pleas for years. The council members shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves, reluctant to embrace change. During the public comment period, voices erupted from both sides. Supporters shared personal stories of struggle and resilience. Opponents warned of dividing the community and clung to the rhetoric of tradition. After hours of heated debate, the council agreed to form a task force to investigate the coalition's claims. A small victory, but a step forward. Beyond politics, Grace's personal life grew more complicated. The strain of constant battles took a toll on her relationships. Friends who once stood by her became distant, fearful of association. She faced loneliness and moments of doubt. One night, sitting alone in her modest home, she questioned whether the fight was worth the cost. The memories of war, the battles, the loss, the sacrifices, haunted her, now intertwined with this new struggle for acceptance. But then she thought of the young veterans who looked to her as a beacon, the families suffering in silence, the children growing up in a town still shackled by prejudice. Her resolve steeled. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every forgotten voice. Grace also found solace in Sarah's unwavering support. The journalist's stories continued to bring national attention, shining light on the town's cracks and sparking conversations in places far beyond Willow Creek. Together, they organized forums, workshops, and healing circles where people could confront painful truths and envision a more inclusive future. Slowly, some walls began to crumble. Schools incorporated lessons on the town's complex history. Local businesses adopted diversity policies. A few previously outspoken critics softened their stance after hearing firsthand accounts of discrimination and resilience. Yet, not all change was welcomed. Late-night vandalism targeted Grace's home and the community center. Threatening messages were scrawled on coalition flyers. The hate that had lurked beneath the surface now revealed itself in ugly bursts. Grace refused to be intimidated. Each act of hatred only underscored the necessity of the fight. With every challenge, she grew stronger, more fearless, more vocal. Her voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a rallying cry. One afternoon, as the coalition prepared for a major community event celebrating veterans and diversity, Grace stood before a mirror. The woman staring back was worn but unbowed. She knew the road ahead was fraught with obstacles, but she also knew that change, no matter how slow, was happening, and she would be there every step of the way. The months that followed were a crucible for Grace, a relentless test of her spirit, endurance, and belief in justice. The movement she helped ignite was growing steadily, gathering strength in numbers and voices. Yet with every triumph came a sharper cost, a weight pressing heavier on her shoulders. Grace's days became a whirlwind of tireless activity. Meetings with community leaders stretched long into the night. Rallies were planned and executed with a fervor born from shared pain and hope. She spoke at schools, churches, town halls, anywhere people would listen. The coalition of veterans, activists, and allies blossomed into a beacon of hope, but also into a marked target for those clinging to old power structures and prejudices. The subtle isolation she had once felt transformed into something unmistakably hostile. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings stopped arriving. Old friends she had trusted grew distant, their glances filled with hesitation or thinly veiled disapproval. Even among veterans she had once counted on, some quietly withdrew, afraid of the repercussions of association with what some in the town labeled troublemakers. The backlash was not limited to social rejection. One cold, sleepless night, Grace was jolted awake by the sharp crash of breaking glass. Someone had hurled a rock through her living room window. The police arrived, but their questions felt more like insinuations than genuine concern. It was a clear message. Her activism made her a target not only socially, but institutionally. At her workplace, the pressure was constant and covert. Requests to attend coalition meetings were denied with vague excuses. Rumors circulated that her activism was distracting her from her duties, that she was stirring division. These whispered attacks chipped away at her confidence, but Grace refused to let them define her or derail her mission. Her nights became a fragile refuge, moments where tears were allowed to flow freely and the weight of loneliness pressed down heavily. She missed the sense of belonging she once had. The warmth of acceptance before her fight for justice made her a pariah to some. Still, amid the hardship, there were rays of light. The younger veterans she mentored showed remarkable courage, their voices growing stronger and their steps surer. They reminded Grace why she had to keep moving forward. Letters poured in from across the country, from strangers touched by her story, messages of solidarity and encouragement that buoyed her spirit. A major breakthrough came when a sympathetic state senator agreed to sponsor legislation aimed at expanding veterans' benefits and bolstering anti-discrimination protections within veteran services. The news was met with cautious optimism, a beacon signaling that change was possible. But progress stirred up even fiercer opposition. Local newspapers published scathing editorials, accusing Grace of exploiting her military service and fomenting division within the community. Social media became a battleground where anonymous voices hurled hateful insults and threats. Grace read these attacks carefully, feeling the sting but refusing to be silenced. She penned a powerful public response, calling for unity and reminding the town that true patriotism required fighting for all veterans' dignity, especially those forgotten or marginalized. Her message resonated far beyond the town's borders, drawing support from civil rights organizations, veteran groups, and everyday citizens. The coalition organized a large, peaceful rally in the town square. Hundreds gathered, holding signs and chanting calls for justice and recognition. For the first time, the local media and officials could no longer ignore the groundswell of support. The community was finally seeing the strength and unity Grace's leadership had nurtured. Grace stood on the stage, her voice steady and resolute. "This fight is bigger than me," she told the crowd. "It's about honoring every sacrifice, acknowledging every story, and building a future where no veteran is forgotten because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Grace felt surrounded by warmth and genuine solidarity. Even some who had once turned their backs now stood with her. Yet, she knew the road ahead would be long, with many more battles to fight. That evening, she met with Sarah, the investigative journalist who had stood by her side since the beginning. They reflected on the journey, how far they'd come, and how much remained to be done. "You're changing this town, Grace," Sarah said softly. "One heart at a time." Grace smiled, fatigue lining her face. "I hope it's enough." She wrestled with the scars of war and the emotional toll of fighting an entrenched system. Therapy helped, but some wounds were deep and slow to heal. Then came devastating news. A close friend and fellow veteran had been denied critical medical treatment due to discrimination. The heartbreak reignited Grace's fire. She visited her friend in the hospital, clasped her hand, and promised their voices would grow louder, their fight fiercer. Renewed and relentless, Grace expanded the coalition's reach. She forged partnerships with schools, churches, and local businesses to educate and foster unity. Slowly, the town's fabric strained and stretched, bending toward change. She understood that healing would demand discomfort, that progress often comes through conflict. With determination blazing brighter than ever, Grace prepared to face whatever battles lay ahead, knowing every voice raised was a step closer to justice. Years had passed since Grace first stepped into the shadows of neglect and prejudice. The town she once knew, one riddled with silence and disregard, had slowly begun to transform. Change never came easy, and the scars of the past still lingered like faint echoes in the streets and hearts of its people. But Grace's voice, once drowned out by ignorance, had become a beacon of hope and resilience that inspired many. Her fight had reshaped the community's understanding of what it meant to honor a veteran. No longer was service measured only by medals and ceremonies, but by the respect, care, and inclusion afforded to every person who wore the uniform, regardless of race, gender, or background. Grace had watched as local schools introduced new curricula honoring the diverse contributions of Black veterans and other marginalized groups. Memorials were rededicated, and the stories of forgotten heroes found their rightful place in town history. The Veterans Center, once underfunded and overlooked, flourished with programs addressing mental health, employment, and support services. Programs she had helped advocate for tirelessly. But beyond these visible victories, the real triumph was in the changing hearts and minds. Conversations that had once been taboo became part of community dialogues. Neighbors who had turned away now stood side by side in efforts to build a more inclusive and compassionate future. The sense of shared humanity began to weave its way into the fabric of everyday life. Grace had become a mentor and leader to a new generation. Young people looked to her not only as a symbol of courage, but as a guide on how to confront injustice with dignity and strength. She spoke at conferences, shared her story with wide audiences, and continued to advocate for those whose voices were still unheard. Her own life, marked by battles both on foreign soil and at home, had found a measure of peace. The weight of loneliness and rejection had lifted, replaced by the warmth of friendships forged in struggle and solidarity. One quiet afternoon, Grace sat on the porch of her modest home, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the town she loved and helped change. Her hands, worn but steady, rested on the lap of a young woman, a fellow veteran and friend she had mentored. They talked quietly about the future, about dreams of a community where every person's sacrifice was honored, and every voice mattered. In that moment, Grace felt the profound truth of her journey, that the greatest battles were not always fought on distant battlefields, but within the hearts of those determined to make their world a better place. Her story, once forgotten and dismissed, had become a legacy, one of courage, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. And though the road ahead would always hold challenges, Grace knew that the sound of her voice, echoing through the lives she touched, would carry on, inspiring change for generations to come.